Welcome to the first video in a new series. So this series I've titled The Scientific Method or Application of the Scientific Method. And what we're doing here is we're talking about how the scientific method can be applied to things we're going to do in class. So a lot of times when students come into my classes, they can tell me that the steps of the scientific method. But if I ask them to create a summary of their data, using a chart. Maybe they can't do it either physically in the spreadsheet or they're not sure how to interpret the chart. So the whole purpose of this series is to go through and look at all the steps of the scientific process, the scientific method. And at the end, hopefully, the goal is to allow the student to create their own experiment, do experimental design, summarize their own data, and come up with their conclusions. Now, to go back over the steps of the scientific method, I've written a very brief lab report because lab reports are the synthesis and the summary of the scientific method. And I like to have my students write lab reports. I think it's effective not only for their verbal skills, their language skills, but it helps them kind of then break down the steps of the scientific method. So the first step, if you remember from your previous classes, is to create or ask a question. So you've got to ask a question. So the question I came up with was, how much sugar is in salad dressing? And I just went to the fridge and I pulled out 5 or 6 bottles of salad dressing. So you'll notice the first section is called the abstract. And I have dots down here. So if I want to type notes, I can just add notes in. And I put them in red so you can distinguish my notes from the very simple lab report. So in the abstract, we want a summary of what's going on in this experiment. Now, ideally, what you've done is after you've asked your question, you create a hypothesis. So my question was, I wonder if there's different amounts of sugar in salad dressings. And my hypothesis is that I believe there are different amounts of sugar in salad dressings, and some salad dressings have more and some salad dressings have less. So the abstract's kind of a summary of those two things. And so my abstract here is the purpose of this study is to determine which salad dressing has the most added sugar. So what we're doing here is we're summarizing our question or our hypothesis. Now, as you get up into more advanced writing classes and more advanced science classes, it definitely needs to be a summary of your hypothesis. And it might even be a quick few details on how you're conducting the experiment. But for our purposes, we're talking about freshmen, sophomores, maybe juniors and seniors. It's just going to be a summary. Now, the next section is the introduction. And a lot of high school lab reports don't have this. But if you look online and you're looking at other lab reports, you'll see that they do. So the introduction is background information that might tell you why we're interested in this study and details about the study that you need to know. So in this case, I have many modern foods have extra sugar added to them. These are known as hidden sugars. Too much sugar has been shown to be bad for health. So in this case, we're looking at the why the study is being conducted. I'm going to zoom this screen in just a little bit, make it a little easier to read. It's a little too much. Or it can also provide background information, like definitions for terms, maybe that would be unfamiliar. So if you're doing a lab on pH, maybe your reader wouldn't know what pH is. So that's the purpose for introduction. And again, it may or may not be there. But the next section is mandatory, and this is the method section. And the purpose of this section is to explain how the experiment was done in enough detail that the experiment can be repeated. So in this case, the nutrition labels on 5 different salad dressings were compared to see how much sugar they contained. Again, I just grabbed 5 bottles of salad dressing. I looked at the amount of grams of sugar that they had, and that's it. So that's why it's a very basic lab report. But if you were conducting an experiment that had multiple steps and used multiple pieces of equipment, you want to list your equipment here, and you want to list very specifically what you're doing with that equipment so that this experiment could be repeated. So one of the keys here for the method section is you have to have enough detail for the experiment to be reproduced. And there's a whole category of science that does nothing but repeat experiments. A lot of times, if you're an experimental chemist or an experimental physicist, one of the big chunks of your job will be to look at studies that have been conducted or experiments that have been run, and to repeat those to make sure that the data that they got the first time was good, was a valid data. So again, the big takeaway here, method. And if we go back to the scientific method, step 1 is to come up with a question and form a hypothesis. Step 2 is to design an experiment and conduct it. And that's what the method section is. The method section is the second step of the scientific method. Sometimes this is also called procedure. So you might see this written out as procedure. All right, so after we've formed our question hypothesis and we've set up our experiment, we carry out the experiment, the next step in the scientific method is to gather data. That's what the results section is. So in the results, we see a summary of our data. So I'm going to put that in all caps. This needs to be a summary, not our raw data. Now, in this case, there isn't really a difference because I just grabbed, again, 5 bottles of dressing. But let's say I had, and in my conclusions, I talk about the fact it would have been better to take 5 bottles of French and 5 bottles of honey mustard from different manufacturers and to take the average of those. So I would have taken the grams of sugar from all 5 different French, added it, divided it by 5, and my number would be here. That would be a summary. You never want to put raw data in your results section. Also, you always want to, in your summary, almost always use a table or a graph. And we're going to look in a lot of detail at what graph to choose and how to make those graphs. What you do not want to put in your results section are reflections on what your data shows. So in this section, you have no conclusions or ideas. None of that goes in the results. So oftentimes the results section will only be tables, graphs. And when I have my upper level students look at actual scientific papers, I ask them to tell me in the results section, how many tables and graphs did the author use and what type were they? That's really what we're after here. So again, correlating this to the scientific method, abstract, we've got our question, hypothesis, method, we've got our procedure, results, this is the data we collected. Now, at the end of the scientific method, you want to look at the data you collected and you want to determine, was your hypothesis correct or was it incorrect? And if I have to go back through this process, what would I do different? And that's part of the conclusions that often students overlook. So my conclusion section for this paper is that the dressings with the most sugar are French and honey mustard. The dressings with the lowest amount of sugar are ranch and Italian. And then I go on to talk about what wasn't ideal. What could I do better if I did this again? The data was obtained by looking at the value from one brand of dressing, example, Kraft, Hidden Valley Ranch, etc. It would be better to take the average of the sugar from 4 to 5 different brands. So the 2 things you want to have in your conclusion. First of all, you want your observations, and then from those you want to derive your conclusions. And we're going to talk in other videos about the difference between an observation and a conclusion. I want to mention it here as well. If I look at my graph, my bar graph here, my observation is that there are different size bars. I'm noting something about the data. I'm noting that there are differences between the data. Or maybe you notice on a line graph that it peaks at the certain time every day. A conclusion would be an explanation as to why. Now, it's a little hard to draw conclusions because this is such a basic report, but let's say it was a study where I was looking at the amount of time my students spent on homework on school nights. And I noticed that every Wednesday, the time drops. Now, maybe that's because that's the observation. The observation is that I have a time decrease on Wednesdays. The conclusion is the why. Maybe it's because students are more tired on Wednesday. Maybe it's because there is the same athletic event on Wednesdays, or maybe there's a function in the community on Wednesdays that ties up their time more. I would have to do further studies to determine that. So that's my next hypothesis. So that's why it's also good to talk about what could I do better if I do this again? So in our conclusions section, the first chunk of it is the observations that lead to the conclusions. And the second part is what went wrong or what was less than ideal and how can it be improved? Those both always need to be in your conclusion section. So that takes us to the end of the scientific method. I have asked my question, formed my hypothesis, conducted an experiment, gathered my data, formed my conclusions, and now can I stop, or do I need to go back and do I need to do another round, or I consider a follow-up hypothesis? But you can see the two go hand in hand. And so if you can write a lab report, you can do the scientific method. And I'd rather see you do it than memorize it. And that's going to be the goal of this series, is to at the end, have you designing your experiments and carrying them out and writing some basic lab reports. Okay, in the next video, we're going to talk about dependent, independent variables, because you always want to compare two things in a study. You don't want to have usually a lot of different variables, and we'll talk about the definitions of those. All right, thanks for watching.